Thanks everybody for joining the GitLab 12.4 retrospective. I will paste the document location in the chat window for those interested in following along. Want to wish everybody a great morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're located in. As always, the retro consists of several parts. First, we'll talk about previous retro items. We'll talk about what went well this month, which I'll basically talk about. Also talk about what went wrong this month, and then we will talk about how we can improve. And last but not least, we'll show any improvements for the next release that we want to focus in on. So with that, I will kick off, and please bear with me as I will talk extremely quickly. If you are on ×2 on the recording, I may even sound even faster than that. We will start off with previous retrospective improvement tasks. Daniel Croft, are you on the phone? Okay, Daniel's not here. So last report, he had introduced a more structured way of doing issue weightings. Basically, they were seeing that they were having troubles with misdeliverables that were attributed to basically sizing not being correct. So they implemented a lightweight issue weighting and evaluating the impact. Going to 12.6, they're going to use a more Kanban type system, similar to what Geo is doing. If anybody's interested, Geo has done a pretty extensive demonstration of what they do for their workflow process. So it's pretty interesting to go look at on their page, and they go to week. So for those teams interested in that, please go to their handbook page. I had an action item as well from last time where I needed to evaluate the workflow as far as the verification step, whether it's in the right place in the sequencing or if it can actually be combined with the previous one. There's no update for this retro. Didn't make progress there. Mech, you have the next one in efficiency?
Yes, so we did complete the Review Apps cluster health monitoring. We added a Google Stack driver dashboard and alerts for the engineering and productivity team. So I'm happy to say we crossed that out. On to the next one.
Cool. There was a theme last retro around process efficiency, so we were going to perform an audit. We didn't perform the audit, but we now have additional data from the 12.4 retro, so thanks for everybody putting that in. What we've done is we've essentially added that information to the issue, and then I've actually reassigned it to Chengdu to drive for the next 12.5 retro, so we'll get an update there. Next one is from 12.2 updates. Mech, you have the first one?
Sure. So we didn't get to this this release, but we'll double down on this sorry, we didn't get to this last release, but we double down on this release because we focused on the Review App cluster health monitoring, and yeah, no updates.
Cool. And then Seth Berger, are you on the phone?
Yep. Yeah. So we are working on better monitoring in Sentry. So right now, the best we've got is we check Sentry on a weekly basis as part of our schedule, but there's a Slack Sentry integration that we're playing around with. I hope to have that set up in a week or two, and then we'll see how that goes as to whether that's a good way to get errors out of Sentry and into our specific team.
Cool. Thanks for that update, Seth. Cool. Now we'll go into the what went well this month. I'll have to remember to say that clearly next time. Essentially, this is a section where I talk quickly through these, so you'll hear me kind of highlight some key points. So in the end-to-end test coverage, I'd like to point out that we found real bugs. This is awesome that the quality team has been able to do end-to-end tests finding real bugs. Super important that we are finding these prior to our customers catching these, so that's really cool from that perspective. In the scheduling, a couple teams, Create and Plan, seem to have gotten their scheduling just about right for their queues. They're seeing them empty at the end of the month with good velocity associated with that. So that's pretty exciting from that perspective. Listening to our users, we've had our first problem validation and other validation work going on. First problem validation, super excited to see that process in place. Glad that Christy and the team, the UX team, has been able to do that for a feature. Moving into collaboration, the memory team has started using Reviewer Roulette, which is cool to see. They've also added in the database team, they've added a second database maintainer. So that's hopefully going to reduce some pressure on DB maintenances and reviews associated with that. We're excited about that. We also, I believe, have several in queue over the next several months, which is great to see as well. And then for fulfillment, we had our first major feature as basically a complete team. They grew a lot as a team, so it's good to see them working as a team from that perspective. And then last but not least, Geo had weekly calls where they're scheduling between EM and PM in that stable counterparts model, and it's been working really well for them. Also, they did a proof of concept that resulted in a positive way to drive some long-term code changes forward. So they got some good information from the proof of concept and essentially using that to figure out what to do next. In results, we definitely have seen some productivity improvements both in Geo and ecosystem, where they both have seen increases in closing out issues that they were excited about. And then last but not least, in the reference architecture section, we've got to a 25K reference architecture, which is super cool. And then 50K is quite on its heels. It's made a lot of progress. We've discovered some performance issues, which I know are getting addressed. And it's really cool to see us basically scaling the hosted solution in that fashion. Now, as far as what went wrong this month, big discussion around a lot of folks rushing to make the cutoff. We made a big change about a month, 2 months ago, I guess it is now, where we basically moved the deployment and the planning phases to basically line up with the deployment that finishes on the 18th. We've recognized that this is really, really tight and causes a lot of folks to rush. Because of that, we're going to look at how best to correct for that issue. This is basically a difference between continuous delivery and feature freeze, depending on which team you work with. This can be a important point from that perspective. Next, we definitely have also seen some challenges with certain issues not having sufficient detail, and it's required us to go back and forth with a little bit. This is an example where we'll have to think about how better to make this a seamless process, but we have a bunch of new folks, and it's totally understandable that we probably are still working on trying to make sure we're providing the correct information associated with it. And then next up is validation. Essentially, the large portion of this is we need more users to participate, so that the validation actually makes sense. Right now, participation sounds like it's a little bit low from that perspective. MRs, or maintainer reviews, merge requests versus maintainer reviews. A couple things that came out of that was around basically breaking our MRs to be smaller. If folks haven't seen in the weekend review, in the engineering weekend review, I did add a MR that's basically talking about how we push ourselves to have smaller MRs. This is a good example where either we have large MRs being submitted, and because of that, they're taking longer to review, or we're having trouble breaking problems down, so that the MR goes to the person with the most knowledge in that area so that they can review it associated with that. Next up, want to point out that Puma still hasn't been deployed yet. We had a road bump we discovered couldn't deploy it without affecting downtime, so that had to basically be addressed, and we've devised a plan to move forward associated with it. That's number 7. And then staging challenges, number 8. Staging basically sounds to be having periods of instability. So we need to make sure that we're getting proper attention associated with that. Similarly, the customer portal is non-functional currently in staging. So that's going to obviously be a challenge to validation out in staging associated with that. And then the master test is fully overwhelmed the quality department, or I should say not fully, but overwhelming the quality department. Basically, the number of tests and the pipelines associated with that has caused a number of issues. So they've also added a large number of tests as well, so they're taking too long. So we're gonna have to figure out how to better break that apart from that perspective. And then last but not least, number 11, the large security issue. Around Elasticsearch, where large is not the actual security issue, but the Elasticsearch effort to fix the security issue took a long time, and in part that was due to the fact that it was a complicated problem associated with that, so it took a few members to do associated with that. And I'm assuming that the P1S1 pairing proposal is a direct result of this one associated with that. Now we move on to how we can improve, which is where we spend most of our time in this call. We've got about 15 minutes left, so hopefully we can get through this in the last section. We'll start with the reviewer roulette. Jan from Plan, are you on? Okay. Basically, this is around kind of similar thoughts around the earlier process where basically getting specific domain experts in place it would be very valuable to the team. So while reviewer roulette gets you to a reviewer, it doesn't necessarily get you to the one with the domain experience. So we need to make sure that we can find the correct reviewer in certain cases without overwhelming one particular reviewer in a given month. So in some ways, giving the capability to pick, but not necessarily always forced from that. Yarka from Plan, are you on? Okay, he has a similar comment, basically talking about the reviewer pieces. And then John, who's not in attendance, had similar comments around this. And as you'll see in our action items, this is one of the actions that we'll include as part of one of the audit pieces, is to basically look at this reviewing process and figure out how best to do it. Going to item 2, more detailed issues. Christy, do you want to give us some over?
Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to say thank you to everybody who joined in on these items to provide your feedback. That was really helpful. From the UX side, we are going to take a closer look at issues earlier and proactively communicate with our product managers when we realize the details are either insufficient or outdated. We're going to clearly state when we're blocked by not having the information that we need, and then we're going to actively monitor the issue for responses so that it doesn't accidentally just fall off. Coming out of this, we're also going to determine whether or not we need any issue template or handbook updates to help support this process.
Michelle, do you want to verbalize your point?
Sure. Mine is very similar to some of the others, especially pretty much what Christy said. We need to be more prepared with our issues. And we're also not involving our counterparts. That's one of the things that I kind of see. The engineers will take an issue and then later on we'll discover what does so-and-so think about this, and that kind of changes the scope there. So we don't have a concrete solution on how to do that. We just know that we're needing to find a solution to that. And being more proactive. So one of the steps that we'll try to take there is taking a look at those upcoming issues in advance, and we'll see if that's a meeting that we need to have or a change that we need to make.
Cool. Adriel, do you want to comment on yours?
Yeah, in the monitor team, we have just noticed that a lot of our decisions that we make throughout the course of a milestone get made during the milestone, which isn't bad. There's a lot of comments happening in the issue, which is where we want them to happen. But in order to kind of give us a single source of truth, once we do arrive at some of those decisions that impact issue direction and implementation details, we've decided we're going to try and move those up into the issue description. So we end up with a checklist and a single source of truth for what our definition of done is for that issue. And that way, other people or community contributors as well who want to come in and get involved know what it is we're working towards.
Thanks, Adriel. I think this is one of the things that I've noticed is I don't want to say I'm guilty of it as much as the next person. So when I say the term sloppy, it's probably not the right term. But do you think there's a place in the handbook we should update to kind of reflect this, or do you want to double check to make sure that the handbook is kind of reflected of that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the right place to start. I'll double check for that. Thank you.
All right, thanks. And if not, get an MR up and assign it to whoever the appropriate owner is to get it merged. Cool. I don't believe Dan is on the phone, so I will talk to this one, which is Conan implementation took a little bit longer. There was some vacation time from the DRI, which wasn't accounted for. So this is a good example of making sure we properly planned based on everybody's availability for a given effort. Nick, are you on the call, and would you like to verbalize yours?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of the backlog that ecosystem is starting to work on contains issues that are quite old, that have been open for like 2 to 3 years. So we found that those could have used some more grooming and verification before bringing into the iteration. Some of them already ended up being resolved or being duplicates of other issues. So something that we're going to do going forward is just discuss a better process for clarifying and grooming these sorts of issues that are potentially outdated.
Cool, thanks. Christy, you're up.
Yeah, so going back to, we are struggling to find external participants for research, especially for some of our more technical areas. So our new research coordinator, Emily von Huffman, is doing two things. So one, she is proactively working to grow our participant list through a few different ways. But then also she's going to update the content on the GitLab First Look page so that it's clearer what the program is, what we're asking of people, how they can participate. I think that'll make a difference too.
Excellent. Dan, want to talk about smaller MRs?
Yeah, sure. So we actually just submitted a merge request to the handbook about this. But basically the thinking is, at least in analytics, we have these really big features and submitting MRs that are essentially non-functional hasn't seemed like an option, hasn't really felt like an option. So this merge request in the handbook is just kind of proposing that as long as a merge request doesn't break anything, if it's part of a really pretty large feature, then breaking it down into, chunks of feature flags and database migrations and backend logic and front end, just really breaking it down into, potentially non-functional parts is still okay. And in fact, even encouraged just to keep those MRs small and keep the throughput high.
Cool. And similarly, Vitali is who I don't believe is on the call, is making a similar comment about that the bigger the MR, the longer it takes to review, and because of that, it can get stuck. So it's definitely our policy to have small MRs. And if you catch the other sister MR associated with this in the weekend review, please go and read that, because it's a super important one that we make sure that we're bringing things up as much as possible. Michelle, you're up in collaboration.
Yes, we saw an issue that sort of drug past is like a month and a half with this issue, and it was because it encompassed more than one person. In this case, it was front and back end. So what we're really just recommending is, if your issue is going to be that closely tied to a counterpart, to really just sit down, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, in a Google Doc and kind of align on what that definition of done is for both parties. Because it really came into I do my work, you do your work, and then it stays in limbo for a really long time. So just more alignment, whether that's a phone call or whatever it may be, in order to map out your plan. And that can go into breaking that issue down into those MRs as well, if you know what needs to be done first, second, and third.
Cool. Adriel, you have the next one?
Yeah, another thing that we've been working towards for a little while now is to get designers preferably a full milestone ahead of engineering. And that gives UX more space to kind of scope the work, to find problems, test solutions, and just overall better manage their time. It's something we've been working towards. We need to continue improving. I know we do have some good documentation around our timeline as it relates to PMs or product managers and engineering managers specifically. We don't have as much that I've seen in the handbook surrounding how we work with UX in this regard. So perhaps that would be also another opportunity for us to update our product planning timeline and document some of those decisions as we do them.
Cool. And Darva, you have the next one?
Yeah. So during this release, we realized there's a lack of understanding between what QA does and what we do. So we're going to bridge the gap by first bringing them in a little bit earlier in the release planning process, as well as getting more information about what their processes are, what our role is in the process, and what their role is in the process.
Thanks, Darva. And then Adriel, do you want to verbalize the earlier pseudocode freeze proposal?
Absolutely. So this is, I know we're trying to get away from code freeze. We're not trying to reinstate it by any means, but for especially for features where we need a lot more feature assurance on the product side of things. We've been considering trying out an earlier pseudocode freeze for our team where we set an earlier cutoff date for features that we want full assurance and confidence will make it into that milestone. I see here that you noted that this is something that we're talking about beyond just that the monitor stage is reevaluating some of those timelines as well, which is great to see.
Correct. Just to fully share, so that proposal is around giving EMs become the DRI for the content of the release posts. Essentially, it has a proposal in there for the 17th. I'm actually thinking that we want to make the cutoff maybe the 15th or the first. If the 15th falls on a weekend or a non-business day, that we make it the day before that, the first business day before that, I should say. I'm still desperately trying to figure out how to articulate that properly. The other thing to note here is that Darby Frey is looking at potentially, we created a simple script that basically tells us whether or not a particular MR is in a release. Last week, because it's now posted in there. By release, I mean in production. So we can actually determine this pretty easily. And Darby's looking at that because what we really want to get to is automation around this potentially so that we don't have to waste any engineering managers' time or product managers as well. So eliminate the toil in this particular case by creating automation to basically reflect that. Teams will still need to plan to get things in by a particular date to make the .com deployment that then gets cut for the release. So you can't get away from that aspect of it, but it does help from a perspective of what's in versus what's not in. Cool. Darva, bring us home in pair programming for P1S1 issues.
All right, so we mentioned earlier, we had an Elasticsearch issue that required the effort of multiple engineers. It took us a while to get there. So what we're proposing is to immediately, once the issue has been identified as a P1S1 and difficult and complicated, to pair program on that issue. So we're working on an issue for that now.
Cool. And then last but not least is improvements for next release to track. So these are the ones that I've added already. Folks have additional ones, please feel free to add. Daniel had already put in that he wants to document the think big meeting structure into the handbook. So basically I was asking for an issue or an MR associated with that so we can track that. Darva's work on adding pairing capability to P1S1 issues so that we make sure that we have the right amount of scope and effort and people assigned to an effort with that. People assigned to that effort when those issues come up. Next up is the workflow needing to be reevaluated and looking at the verification step. So we'll continue to track that one. Similarly, I've reassigned the audit one around reviewers and reviewer roulette to Chun so that he can figure out how to best work that so that we can get a better experience, developer experience for that aspect of it. And then last but not least, the timeline associated with the fact that we don't know what content's going into the release, and consequently we're scrambling right at the end, and that needs to improve to give both better developer, engineering manager, director, VP of engineering experience. So looking forward to that aspect of fixing that up. Are there other improvements that we should track for the next release? Okay, somehow I finished 80 seconds. So I'm gonna give it a quick pause to see if there are any questions. All right, thanks everybody for a great retrospective and a great release. Appreciate it all. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.